is the Advocacy Committee meeting, and I appreciate you guys sharing some time. In particular, I thank staff for doing this. I know y'all have a few other things going on, so we'll be respectful of your time. I just thought it would be a good idea maybe to take some opportunity to just regroup on some policy work that's happening. And what I'm really interested in is to find out if there are any opportunities where perhaps the Advocacy Committee could bring to the board any type of resolutions or policy positions that would be useful to share both with our delegation or maybe even with the committee work that Scott and Chuck are involved in. So maybe we'll start with Julie. Julie, you're muted right now, but could you maybe just give us an update on any? I know the General Assembly is probably coming back sometime soon. Just for FY20, any particular policy related issues that you think are on the horizon that we need to pay attention to?
Well, I think we're getting feedback. Hold on. Yes. Yeah. Am I okay now? Let me walk over here. I'm getting further away. Okay, what we've got next week, Tuesday, May 12th, is we have the House and the Senate coming back in to reconsider the continuing resolution and also a sine die resolution. They tried to do that before spring break. They got caught up in Santee Cooper politics. Now, what they do have is they are allowing themselves 2 extra weeks to meet if they don't reach conclusions they need to reach on May 12th. But mostly, Derek, it's talking about budget, the continuing resolution, and Santee Cooper.
Julie, are they still talking about coming back in the fall for a revision to the budget for 2021?
Yeah, what they want to do is the year will close out in August, and they'll be able to look at the figures. So they're coming back September 15th, and they're leaving a 2-week window, and then they're leaving it open till November 8th if they need to come back at all. But they said they can't really consider a lot of the budget till this budget year closes and they see where we stand, and they expect it to be August.
Is there any final news on the federal money that's supposed to come in?
Get a little closer to your microphone, Roy.
Sorry, is there any news on the federal money that may come in?
Well, we know that our share will be a little over $19 million. There are 12 reasons or parameters for which it can be used.
Mm-hmm.
And we have until September of 2021 to use it. So likely what we're going to do is bring you a recommendation with the general fund budget in the workshop and in subsequent readings to hold that 19 million, to use it to backfill any reduction in state funding that we get either this fiscal year or into next fiscal year.
Do we think that will be enough to cover the main problems? Sorry. The main, budgetary issues.
The problem with this, Roy, is there is so much we don't know. So one of the things we're looking at in our budget prep, to bring you a recommendation, is the total amount of state revenue, and what a 5% reduction of that would look like, what a 10% and what a 15% would look like, which seems fairly reasonable with where we are right now. There's some mitigating factors. The state had an extra $2 billion that they're going to use to try to fill the hole this year.
Mm-hmm.
This year being the year we're finishing and the year we're going into. So our big impact may not be until the following fiscal year. So that's very difficult to predict. Now, with the state's revenue being primarily based on income tax and sales tax, and they're contributing around numbers $400 million of our budget. That's $400 million that is less stable. The amount that is on us, the local amount, is far more stable because it's still reliant on property tax.
Mm-hmm.
But a portion of that, and one of the portions that's really grown a lot, has been vehicle tax in the last several years. We always knew that was a bubble. We knew it would break. We didn't know it'd break this quick or plummet as soon. Our last month's revenue dropped $125,000 of vehicle sales tax.
Wow.
Now we're okay. We're okay the rest of this year. We fully believe we're okay the rest of this year. But that's a precursor. But that's probably the most attuned to the economy of all the local revenue. The rest of it's basically property tax based, and outside of vehicles, it's relatively stable, unless you get people who suddenly begin to default on paying their taxes and they lose the property and nobody's paying the taxes. So that wouldn't be too dissimilar to the kind of minimal drop that we had during the recession several years ago. So again, over time, this year, next year, and the following year, that's going to be more stable. So right now, our big concern is the instability of the state revenue, the fact we're going to continue to grow some number of students. We're going to continue to grow. I don't think our growth is going to diminish any. In fact, we may grow a little bit more. There may be people that are paying tuition now to go to a private school that will no longer pay that and come to public schools. So it might bump even a little more than what we've experienced. And depending on what next year looks like as far as the school year, there may be additional costs that we incur. For example, if we started school back under some sort of social conditioning, social distancing conditions, one of the things we'd have to do would be disinfect the buildings every day.
Yeah.
That's an added cost that we don't normally, and our folks do a great job cleaning, but they don't disinfect the building every day. We've bought a number of sprayers. We haven't gotten all of them yet, but we're prepping to be able to do that on a daily basis. But that's going to have an added cost of probably somewhere between $6,800 and $9,100 a day to do every building one time. Now, if you think about having to do it in a high school, you got to make some provision for every time the students change classes and somebody else comes and sits in the desk. Not really an issue at elementary or middle, but issue at high school. So there are all these things that we're trying to work through now to have the best idea of the worst case scenario to provide you a budget that we think will meet that. And we believe the budget we have in the backfill we've got, we could absorb a 5, a 10, and probably a 15% reduction in state revenues over the next year without having to do anything else. Other than we think we can backstop all of that through CARES Act, use of existing fund balance additions that will be created this year, and freezing expenditures within the general fund budget. So the uncertainty comes in some of the language around the use of the CARES Act and what it might look like the next year, but we should be able to better predict that as we get closer to it, and then it gives us the summer to make adjustments, because you all know this. Our money's spent on people. That's 90% of the budget. So if we start losing a whole lot of revenue, we can backstop it for a year, but then we got to cut people, cut positions. Hopefully never cut people, but cut positions to pick up the difference. And that's what we had to do during the recession. But we were able to be in a position where we could do it in the summer preceding the year and handle it in a way that nobody lost their job.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Any other board members have questions for Julie or Dr. Royster about the budget or the General Assembly coming back into session this spring?
Derek, Burke, for what you just said about what we're getting in the CARES Act, it was 219 million going to the state. They take 10% off the top and then divide accordingly. From the conversations we've been having on the task force, that 10% is not going to last long. But am I correct in understanding that any of that 19 million in loose change that we're talking about Greenville getting, we can expend it between the time it's received in September, as you mentioned, but we've got to prove that it's attached to an issue connected to COVID-19?
Well, sort of. There are 12 ways you can use it.
Right.
And the 12th one is to ensure the continuity of district operations, and it specifically mentions including salaries.
Okay.
So that's sort of the catch-all that I think allows us to use that as a general backstop to a shortfall when we're not able to continue to operate the way we're operating this year.
Okay. Thanks for the clarification.
Yes, sir. And
Thank you,
I
Mr.
also had a suggestion, Derek. I don't know if you're ready to get to that point. You asked about an advocacy issue, and I've got a rather large one that I think would be good for you all to look at, but I may not have answered all the questions yet.
Okay. I'll come back to you then if that's all right, Dr. Royster. I see Joy Grayson. Do you have any questions, Joy, about this section?
Following up on Chuck's, how much flexibility do we have with those 12 parameters without going through them one by one? I mean, are you comfortable that they're giving us enough flexibility to use it to do what we need to do?
Yeah, Joy, because I think that where we're going to need it is to fill a hole in revenue. And that last one, that 12th one I just talked about, that's the one that lets us do that. You know, there are all kind of things you can use it for, like expanding technology. Our technology situation is pretty good.
Right.
There are a whole lot of others. To me, if we can maintain the core of what we're doing, that's what's most beneficial to our students. So that thing that allows us to continue our core operation is the one that would be most valuable to them.
One issue that I've seen and heard from is special ed. Are there provisions to catch up special ed kids that are just more difficult to teach through e-learning than your normal kid?
There are some. We do some of that every year. We have some extended school year students every year. There's going to be more of that. One of the things that will be what I mentioned in just a minute, has to do with lobbying for some relief from some of the requirements and some assistance with carrying out the responsibilities.
Right, and that's what I was going to propose, is that the reporting and the strings attached to special ed dollars in this environment are almost impossible to follow. And surely that, in my opinion, that seems to be an easy ask, is to ease up on some of this compliance. That's it. Thank you, Derek.
Thanks. Ms. Morrison Fair, do you have any questions for Julie or Dr. Royster?
No, I think Dr. Royster, my question pretty much he covered in the first part of his of the first part of the things. I wanted to know if we could survive for 2021, and Dr. Royster, you're saying we will also be good for the next year also? Did I hear that right?
Yeah, you might be overly optimistic in what you heard. I think what we will be good for, I think we will know there'll be less uncertainty. It might be a bad year, but I think we'll know how bad, and we'll know it earlier than we know right now. Now, there should also be some more federal money coming down. We just don't know when or how much, or if it'll be structured like the current one, which really structured pretty well. For one thing, requiring that 90% of it come directly to the districts. And with that last point in there of allowing us to use it to make sure we can continue to do school the way we've done it, it seems to have been structured pretty well.
Will you also cover the remedial I guess what will remedial look like when we go back to school in August? Have you gotten to that yet? Will you cover that?
There is some discussion right now at the state level of doing some remediation that the state would pay for in the summer. But to your specific question about what that looks like in the fall, our instructional people are already working on what that needs to look like by grade level for kindergarten through up through the 8th grade. Now, high school level is pretty minimal because it would be only in subjects where you're taking a continuation, like you took Spanish 1 last year and you take Spanish 2 this year. But they're working on frameworks with that for our teachers to have in the fall and to try to regain whatever amount might have been lost. And there'll need to be some assessment of that. We don't really know. But e-learning has been somewhat effective, but it's not as effective as having been in school.
And so that remedial will be done during the school day or before or after the school day?
For the most part, it'll have to be done during the school day.
Okay.
Because we're going to have to operate kind of within the parameters of the budget that we have. If we don't, now you can use that CARES Act money to do things like that, but if we do that and we don't have enough money to run the regular school day, then we will have, in a sense, wasted money on remediation and dug a deeper hole for them because we're not having regular schools to the degree we could. So it's to me, it would not be a good trade-off.
Okay, because I'm sure there has to be a cost associated with that before and after. And I guess you have not looked into that cost.
We know enough about what we run now that we can project a cost on that. And I don't see us having, and you'll see more about that when we do the budget workshop, but we don't have any extra funding to put towards doing something beyond the school day. We just don't.
Okay.
We're going to be lucky to get through the year doing the regular school day, and the extra cost we might have if we have to run without everybody being there every day and supporting a blend of e-learning and regular classroom, disinfecting the buildings. There are just all these other things that, people kind of throw out solutions that, well, we can have half the students there. Well, okay. Well, there are costs with having half the students there that are beyond the cost of having all the students there every day. So we're still trying to work through all that to make sure we have reasonably good projections as to what those things cost and what they look like.
Thank you, Ms. Morsefair. Lisa Wells, did you have any questions for Julie or Mark?
No, I don't.
I think Roy Shamley, you had questions earlier. Did you get all your questions answered? Do you have others?
Yeah. I want to make sure I don't get off into the weeds. So I think what I was mostly concerned about was the budgets, those kind of things. And okay. I think the main thing is, we're looking okay for now, assuming things don't get much worse. If we're still in a ditch by 2021, 22, we probably got other worries to deal with also. So I think the main thing is to, as Dr. Royster was saying, get the model in place to where you can, bob and weave as you need to with more or less income and so forth. So that was probably my first concern there. I am still a little curious, and I'm not sure that this is a good time to discuss it, but are we going to get, I know we've applied for waivers for some of the exams and tests. Do we know that we'll get those yet? Has that already been approved? Do we know for all of them?
Well, they're all approved for this year.
Okay.
One of the things that's happened throughout all of this is at points during this process, there's been a daily call with all superintendents in the state and the state superintendent. We now have at least one a week, and we have brought up now repeatedly, and I think Molly is in agreement with this because it requires a federal waiver. We're already asking for, we think they need to waive testing for next year as well. Okay. And that would be another, I think, advocacy point for you all. I think, to me, IDEA would be one, and waiver of federal testing would be two. But they might be equally important to one another, but those would be the two.
All right, guys, it's not me.
Stay tuned. All right, I believe that Mr. Suddeth is on the call. Mr. Suddeth, do you have any questions for Dr. Royster before we move on to the next section? And you're muted right now, so if you're speaking, make sure you unmute yourself. That may have been him calling us. We'll keep going. Oh, I see another. There's another. Did I get all the board members?
That
Did I
should
miss
be
somebody?
Mr. Meek. It's Mr. Meek.
Mr. Meek, do you have any questions for Dr. Royster or Julie about policy-related issues? Roger, you're also muted, so if you're speaking, I can't hear you.
It says I'm unmuted now. I don't have
Gotcha.
any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Meek. All right. The only question I have,
Derek,
sir, yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Back to one question. Burke, you said you've got a big ask. Is it connected to broadband?
You're talking about as far as advocacy?
Yeah.
No, so I think the biggest one, at least in my mind, although that is one, the biggest one that revolves around IDEA and the fact that we're not getting any relief now from the Secretary of Ed.
Okay, well, if you put a pin in that real quick, let me go back to broadband for a second.
Sure.
Derek, as we're moving forward, there's going to be a pretty big conversation in the legislature and in Washington related to funding for broadband. As of this morning, there's roughly 150,000 households, 160,000 households in South Carolina that do not have access to broadband. So that's between 250,000 to 350,000 students, hypothetically. There's 150,000 students in the state that do not have devices, even if they had broadband in their homes. So those are going to be two needs that need to be funded, and I think from a combination of state and federal as we move forward. So if we could put that on our to-do list.
Okay.
Burke, I'm assuming that if there's 150,000 households in South Carolina that don't have broadband, we've got to be roughly 10% of that.
Yeah, although in this case, we believe we're a little better off than most places, so we may not be exactly 10%. We're working now on trying to precisely pinpoint who doesn't have access out of those who haven't accessed. We have it down by zip code, and I got them working on pinning them on a map so we know every person by their address that hasn't accessed, so we can determine why. Then we're also looking at some solutions that we might provide, like we've done with the buses. We've sent them out to those 22 areas that had the least coverage in the county to provide coverage Monday through Friday.
Right.
We're looking at some scenarios that might help boost that with using some alternatives to the buses. Because if we're in school, even in shifts or even in every other day, we're using the buses to transport students. We don't have that. We don't have that ability during school. So we're looking at some transmitters that can go up on our own towers that have a 5 to 7 mile range, and we're looking at some Wi-Fi spots that really are kind of like the ones on the bus that we could mount on a light pole, like in your church parking lot, and run it off of solar. So
Okay.
we're looking at some things that we might be able to do locally to help fill gaps if they don't get filled nationally. Our number of not being able to be in Google Classroom is very small.
Okay.
So, but that would really help us if we have to go back to an e-learning or a blended model to do a much more rigorous job with e-learning.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Derek.
So, Dr. Royster, you had mentioned some asks for us. So any recommendations that you or your staff have for possible positions or efforts we can focus on?
Yes, and I think we kind of hit on them, although not in detail. Now, Julie has, that I'm going to get her to send it to you. She may send it to you right now. the kind of the talking points from AASA, the superintendent's group. School Board Association probably has a similar one, National School Board, about IDEA. So we certainly want to do that. We would encourage you all to advocate for getting some relief from some of these requirements. We know we need to do more for our special needs students, but we're doing less for our general ed students, and we're still maintaining doing more for them. But there's some things we can't just physically cannot do and maintain social distancing and teach remotely and that sort of thing. And so we need some relief, or temporary relief from some of those requirements. Chuck brought up and mentioned the broadband. We also need to ask for another round of funding from the Fed, or for their other rounds of funding also include local education agencies and the other things that we've mentioned. So a lot of this advocacy is kind of at the federal level. And then I think continue to advocate at the state level that us being able to come back in is not just an education issue, it's an issue related to the greater economy. So there needs to be some consideration of using funds set aside either from the federal government or the state government at the state level to help do some of these things. And I think that one crosses over into the one that Chuck brought up about the broadband. That's an issue that doesn't just affect schools. That affects, particularly affects small businesses. It affects farms and small businesses to a huge degree, having the availability of broadband internet service.
Okay. Well, we'll maybe keep a running list, and then at the end of the meeting, see if there's any appetite for the committee to support maybe a path forward for some resolutions. The next item on the agenda, if it's okay, I think I can see everybody. Does anybody have any other questions before we move on? The next item on the agenda, I think Dr. Royster was going to take, and that was the questions about the 180 days. I think I submitted a question in advance about were we going to end school early, and I think I understood the answer was because of the 180-day requirement, we can't really adjust our school calendar. Can you speak a little to that, Dr. Royster?
Couple of issues come into play there. One is there is a requirement that we go to school 180 days. Now, a lot of the requirements around that have been relaxed as far as seat time and that sort of thing. In the governor's emergency order, he provided the leeway that in the last 2 weeks of every school district's calendar, so it'd be different in different districts, you can use those days for things related to the closeout of the year. Now, there's always been the expectation that you teach 180 days. Then you get down to the end of the year, you got to give exams, you got to take up books, and that sort of thing. So not only was it written in the governor's order, it was in all the discussions we've had about it, sort of been made clear to us the expectation is that you teach up until that last 2 weeks. So our plan, our plan to close out the year is the last time we'll introduce any new material is in the first part of the first of the last 2 weeks. Now that Monday's a holiday, if you recall, that's Memorial Day. So probably Tuesday, Wednesday be the last new material they get because they got to have time to work on it because they need to be able to turn it in by Friday and certainly before the end of the next week. So that we'll end the new teaching sometime during that week and end the availability, except on a just as needed basis of teachers to help them with their work by the end of that week. Then we worked out a schedule for the take up of all materials, a staggered schedule at each school for the final week of school. Now that's except for seniors. By proclamation, by the governor's declaration, whatever, seniors in mid-May. If I say the date, I might say it wrong, but I think it's like May the 18th. So they all end then. So the clear expectation has been, both legally and through the order, that you work up until the last 10 days of your calendar. We're working 2 or 3 days into that last 10. Again, one of them being a holiday, then 2 or 3 days past that. Because I think there is also an expectation, and should be, by the community, because all of us folks are getting paid, that we're working those days, including the teachers. So again, within the caveats that we've already laid out about general expectation for the amount of work and the time of work, but we have already communicated to schools the expectation you need to structure your take-in of materials that last week. And of course, we're working through the graduation issue as well, gathering opinion and that sort of thing. So hopefully that answered your question. I think it's both a expectation by those who are footing the bill, but also more importantly, an expectation of the governor's order that we don't cease before the end of the actual year.
The other part of that question, are you aware that kind of 2-week window is being generally followed by most school districts in South Carolina? Are you aware of any districts that are closing this week and not coming back? I mean,
to my knowledge, districts are generally following that.
Okay.
In fact, I was talking to superintendent one day last week, and they were actually going and asking their board to act on the fact they wanted to close the next to the last week of school, which I didn't quite understand because it's clear in the governor's order you can do that. So you might read about, I think it was Lexington 1 I was talking to. You might read where they're voting to close school early, but what they're voting to do is take the first to close it in that week, kind of like what I just shared with you we're doing. I think they're going to close on like Tuesday. But now, Derek, that's not to say there's not somebody down there who didn't stop 6 weeks ago. Because
I just wanted to make sure I had heard a couple of questions particularly from families who understood that other districts were closing earlier, and I think they were misreading that their calendars may be just different, and so they may be ending work sooner than other districts.
Yeah, like I said, they could have seen that public vote if they ever took a vote on it, or it could simply be their calendars early.
Okay.
For example, I was talking to Danny Merck earlier today over at Pickens, when they're graduating on the 28th or 29th, whatever that Friday is. So their calendar's that far ahead of ours. So their 2 weeks obviously is a week earlier than our 2 weeks. And there's several in the upstate that are at least a week earlier than we are on their normal school calendar. So that's a possibility too.
Okay. Any questions for Dr. Royster on this issue? I'm going to start with Mr. Meek since I can't see his face. So Mr. Meek, if you have any questions, we'll start with you. But you're still muted. If you remain muted,
No questions.
Thank you, Mr. Meek. All right. Ms. Morrison-Fair, any questions? Miss Grayson?
I just have a question about graduation and inter-high council, but I'm sure everybody else does too.
Yep.
Okay. Ms. Wells?
I'll follow along behind Mr. Grayson.
Why don't we just stop there for a second? Joy, you want to, whichever one do you want to ask?
Well, I just, inter-high council has met. What are we going to do? I guess I got two very anxious.
Did you fill out your survey?
Yes, we did.
4 of them.
You know, we want to have it on the football field.
We're not going to have it on the football field. We explained all that to them. But I'll explain it. We sent the survey out first to all of our seniors. And what they overwhelmingly said they want to have is basically as close to traditional graduation as they could have. Even if that meant having it later. Now, that was all of our seniors. So that's pretty, and we had a pretty large number of responses. I don't remember the number right now, but it's pretty high return rate. So once we got that return rate, we then met with the inter-high council and we shared that with them to get kind of a more refined opinion than what you can just get on the survey. What was real interesting, I thought, they were more in favor of them being with their classmates than than, for example, joy than for you being there.
Right. I get that. Believe me.
They were really, because one of the things you could do is stagger the ceremonies where you graduate. A lot of colleges do that. Like the first third of the alphabet, then you bring the next third in, then the next third. So you could have, theoretically, in the same space, you could have more visitors attend. They had no interest in that.
Yeah.
They wanted to be there with all their classmates.
Well, yeah, if their best friend is a Z, then they're going to not show up at the right time anyway.
Right. So we went through and we talked to them, about this thing of on the football fields. They all have this grandiose idea of doing it on the football field. Well, what they didn't, I think, understand from the outset was that wouldn't mean you could have any more people there. In fact, most of our stadiums would not accommodate even 2 guests by maintaining the social distance that we have to maintain. The governor's exemption in his executive order that allows us to have graduation, which is to be able to have groups of bigger than 50 together, it specifically mandates we follow social distancing. So number one, you couldn't get 2 people in there to watch it. So if you wanted to graduate at the football field, they might all have to go to Serene Stadium to graduate because it's the biggest one. Well, I don't think they were all that interested in graduating at Serene Stadium except the ones that went to Greenville High. Once you get in there, you can't see any better than you can see if you're sitting in the Milo Center or Bon Secours. And we got no video ability unless we just go in there and try to rig something up. Then we got to do it in 14 different places. You've been to a football game. How good's the audio?
At Blue Ridge, it's not very good.
It's that way everywhere. It's not good. It's not outstanding at Death Valley where they spent millions of dollars on it, but you can't hear it. So there are all these things about outside is just not good, least of which is what do you do when it rains? Then you got nowhere to go. So we've been working with Bon Secours to try to get them to agree to have it there on the scheduled dates. That's what we're going back and forth with them on. Still working with them. Latest today and yesterday. And we have 2 alternate dates. So when we surveyed the parents, we took the results of the student survey and we took the input from Inter High and we created that survey for the parents, the one you filled out. So far, and I don't remember when the deadline is, but we can watch it in real time. The last time I looked, 57% of the parents wanted to have it on the already established days, and we would do it by moving from 4 days to 5, and we'd have 3, 3, 3, 3, and 2. And that gives enough time to get people in and out. For one thing, Bon Secours, if they agree to it, will require us to disinfect the whole place between graduations. But the plus side to all that is they've got that huge board. So if you don't have a great seat, you got a great seat seeing it on TV. They've got the ability for us to plug into their systems to live stream it on video and to record it so it'll be available forever. And they've got seats there where we can issue 2 tickets. So you have 2 seats, and here's where they are. In all of our stadiums, we'd have to mark off 2 seats with the appropriate space in it and figure out a way to assign you to it because we don't have lettered and numbered rows except in very limited areas. So it's it always has been a good venue for it, but it makes it easier for us to do all the social distancing that we're going to be required to do, plus have them all at the same place the students all in the same place at the same time, and be as close to a regular ceremony as they could have. They didn't want any part of it. Some districts are doing, you can ride through in your car and we'll hand you your diploma. So however big your car is, you can bring that many family members. They didn't want to do that. They want, if none of you as a parent get to come, or none of us get to come, if it's just them and the principal, they'd rather do that than something else. So that's kind of where we are. We hope we'll have, I think it will continue to run in favor of on the appointed days, in that location, 2 guests. I think that's going to be the majority sentiment. Now we can get folks at Bon Secours over their concern about having it. Then I think we're in good shape to proceed almost on schedule. If not, we have 3 other weeks that we've set aside with them.
All right. Thanks, Bert.
On the issue, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I said you're welcome. Go ahead.
I was just going to say on the issue of disinfecting. Bon Secours, I think, does a lot of high-tech disinfecting with UV lights and things like that. And I know I'm beginning to sound like Fred painting a pod car, but UV light disinfections or disinfectants seem to be fairly well established. I think they use them on airlines between flights and things like that. My guess is that you could do a lot of that at Bon Secours. So it might be worthwhile checking with them when you're talking to them. When they want you to disinfect between graduations, what kind of good suggestions would they have?
Well, I would have hoped that they would have been more helpful than actually they were. They weren't all that prepared to disinfect, but we know we can do it. We know we can do it with the equipment that we have. And in fact, actually, one person cleaned an area with 300 seats in it in a little over 5 minutes. We use an electrostatic sprayer, and we use a disinfectant that as soon as it dries, it's accomplished its task. So we've already been over there, run a trial. We know how long it'll take to do it. We know how many people we got. We know how much equipment. So we know within a 30-minute window, we can get the place cleaned, not just the seats, but the graduation area on the floor, spray out the hallways and the restrooms. So we've already run a scenario through with that, with them observing it, to see how we do it, how quickly we could do it. And that seemed to far exceed the ability they had to do the same thing.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yes, sir.
Ms. Wells, did you have any other questions? Mr. Shambly, did you have any other questions?
That's all I have right now. Yeah.
Mr. Sailors, do you have any questions? I think that's Mr. Sudduth. Do you have any questions? Okay. The next item on the agenda, I think Dr. Turner and Mr. Sailors are going to take. We just wanted an update on the committee work that you guys are going to do. So if you guys could just give us maybe a brief summary of what's happened so far, and in particular with an ear towards maybe any recommendations of maybe potential areas for us maybe to focus on in advocacy, to maybe assist you guys in getting some messaging out. Dr. Turner, we'll start with you.
I was hoping you'd start with Mr. Sailors. Julie, can you turn?
Go ahead, Scott. Jump off.
Let me get Julie we're getting a feedback here because Bert's sound is turned up.
You're good. Do you want me to start with Chuck? Is that already good?
I don't know how many of you saw the live stream meetings that we've had. We've had 2 full committee meetings, and I'm the chair of one subcommittee. There are 3 subcommittees. One is dealing with instruction. One's dealing with student services, that's the one Chuck's on. And then I'm on administration and operations. We met again this morning to report out from the subcommittees. And basically what we're doing is making recommendations to the State Department in terms of how we want them to make requests to the governor's task force. They're the ones who have that almost $2 billion. And so as we make these recommendations to the State Department, they are going to formulate plans to go and request funds for these academic recovery camps we have this summer that they're asking us to have in addition to our normal summer reading camps. And that includes cost of all the transportation, all the cleaning, disinfecting, all the PPE. We went through one of the issues we're working through is transportation and social distancing. For example, they've told us if we hold to the 6 feet standard of social distancing, that a 77 passenger bus would only hold 12 students. Well, Molly's told us this morning that they're going to get more guidelines from mass transit and DHEC. So hopefully we can have more students on a bus this summer. But that could also lead into the fall issues that we deal with in the fall in terms of transportation if we're still dealing with social distancing. We've also, as far as my subcommittee, had a lot to do with the finance part of it. We already have the funds for our normal summer reading camps. That money's already been dispersed to the districts, and our academics division had already started planning for those summer reading camps. What we're recommending is that those be blended into one camp, and that we be able to fund a 4-week camp. And I've talked with Jeff McCoy about this because the normal summer reading camp is a 2-week camp. Allow those people to, and they're going to give us the flexibility if we have half-day sessions or full-day sessions, but they want us to focus on ELA and math and also on special ed and ELL populations. And some of you mentioned that earlier on catching those kids up. One of the issues we were asking Molly for in this money that we're talking about them funding these 4-week academic recovery camps is the model they're using is a reimbursement model. And I've talked to Dr. Royster about this, and it may be possible for us to front the cost on that and be reimbursed, but there are districts across our state who can't do that. And so we've asked them about that model of reimbursement. If they have to follow that model, what are the protocols? How quickly can they get the funds refunded to the district? And can they possibly advance some of those funds to districts who cannot begin this process without some advancement of that money? Chuck, I'll stop there, or Derek, and y'all can ask questions.
Chuck, you want to go ahead and give an update on your committee, and then we'll do questions for both of you together?
Thanks, Derek. In addition to what Scott just shared, one of the things that the overall conversation is trying to develop is not a singular recommendation, but a series. That once this package is finished, school districts will have a menu to choose from when it comes to their scheduling, both over the summer, which quite frankly is a dry run, and the fall when we return, depending on whatever the schedule would look like. My subcommittee is chaired by Alan Walters, who's on the State Board of Education out of Georgetown. We're looking at building and student-related services. So not only do we have issues on our committee connected to what does it look like to make sure that the building is adequately set up to meet those social distancing requirements, whatever they may be. Dealing with the transportation component, as Scott mentioned a while ago, there's not a lot of space. You've got, in some cases, having to run 3 bus routes to get all the kids in one spot. So we've got that to contend with, plus making sure the building is sanitary, those kinds of issues. Then we're also dealing with mental health issues. So our committee ended up getting a pretty wide menu of things to deal with. And the one thing that we've discovered very quickly is a lot of what Scott's doing, a lot of what instruction is doing, a lot of what we're doing overlaps. So having to determine which piece of the pie gets to whatever area. In short, right now, everyone's focusing on the summer program. The fall and beyond is something that we will more than likely be addressing toward the end of this month. Scott, I believe we have a deadline of roughly May the 22nd for a report or a series of recommendations to the State Department. And then that $1.9 billion that the governor's getting from the CARES Act or from Washington, it's more than just education getting those funds. It goes back to the state funding conversation we've always had when education, public safety, state employees, et cetera, well, all of them are at the same trough trying to get the same dollars. So the same mechanisms in place. And so people say, oh, great, we got $1.9 billion. Now that's $1.9 billion for the entire state for all services, including healthcare, and public safety, which is more than likely going to eat the vast majority of that money up. So as far as advocacy goes, we'll have to feed you some more requests as they are developed. Right now, we don't have a solid plan finalized. We're still gathering information. And so it may be that we have to come back to the committee and say, can you help us with X, Y, Z? For example, broadband. If we need help with anything right now, it's getting everyone's attention related to the fact that we need help with broadband. I hope that answers your question.
Any questions for Dr. Turner or Mr. Sailors? Mr. Shamley, I'll start with you since you're leaning forward.
I'm anxiously awaiting answers, but I have no questions.
Okay.
We're waiting answers too.
Ms. Morrison-Fair, do you have any questions for Dr. Turner or Ms. Sailors?
Oh, wow. It's almost like a nightmare. I
Two of
think
them speaking is
Dr. Turner, of the things that you spoke about, would you think that transportation would be the biggest hurdle? Or is transportation just a matter of, I guess, X number of buses, making sure kids get to where they need to be, and if districts don't have enough buses, getting additional buses to those districts?
I think that, yes, transportation is a concern. Hopefully we can overcome some of the parameters of only allowing 13 kids on a bus at a time. But in one of the first proposals, they did not include the cost of the drivers. And we pushed pretty hard that they were going to have to go back and pay for the cost of the drivers for the bus, not only the gas and the mileage that were put on the buses. The other thing that we're dealing with is, we've already started calling, our academics department has already started calling families for the summer reading camps. And there's some fear out there about students coming back into buildings. And so we're going to have to reassure people that we have, PPE for students and teachers, that we're going to do the checks, that we have nurses stations that are staffed and ready to serve those children. And it may be a mix. There may be some families who choose to do virtual academic recovery camps, and there may be people who feel comfortable coming back into the buildings. But that goes to the social emotional piece that Chuck spoke about, that we're going to have to work with families and students and staff members all on that part. I think one of the biggest hurdles we're going to have to get over, maybe not for Greenville County, but for other districts, is this reimbursable piece, where they are making districts front the cost for these camps.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Morrison-Fair. Ms. Grayson.
I don't have any questions. I appreciate what y'all are doing. It's a monumental hurdle.
Ms. Wells, do you have any questions? I can't hear
So,
you.
yeah, kind of related to thinking about the transportation, do you use PPE to mitigate some of the distance thing? And if you do, is there some different way to put kids on the bus in terms of grade levels and ages? I mean, are you guys having those kinds of conversations? Are you just still kind of waiting? Are you having to kind of wait and see what kind of guidance you get?
We've looked at different variations of bodies and seats so far. This is where, as I mentioned earlier, this topic covers part of what Scott's group is doing and part of what my group is doing. So there's some overlap there. From our side of it, it's not only the fact that you can find creative ways to get more children on the buses, but if it's a bus with elementary age kids, how realistic is it to expect anywhere from 12 to 25 students to sit in a seat and face forward and not take their mask off if they're required to wear one, that they're not going to turn around and talk to their friends, et cetera, et cetera. So then the question comes up, well, do you put a monitor on the bus? If you put the monitor on the bus, who's paying that salary? So again, those are issues that we've brought up, and the staff's looking at different ways to answer those questions. Scott?
Yeah, Lisa, one of the things we talked about was the PPE before they get on the bus. So we even talked about doing a temperature check at the bus stop, but the problem is the liability. Let's say you do a temperature check at the bus stop and a child has a fever. You can't leave that child at the bus stop because we have a liability there. So we are trying to work through those kinds of scenarios in terms of every child may be wearing a mask on the bus, getting them to the school, then doing a temperature check, and if they have one, putting them in an isolation room, because your parents may not be able to come pick them up at that point. So there are a lot of things that we're going to have to work through, or the state's going to have to work through, as scenarios we haven't even thought about yet.
Okay. And it's hard to figure out what all the answers are and how effective any of those solutions are going to be in really protecting our kids. So,
well, and
thank you.
And one of the additional challenges is 80 different ways to do it. Because every district, what happens if every district wants to do it a different way, or a different component of how the master plan looks, or different menu items look? That it's an additional challenge that we, quite frankly, don't even know how to address right now.
Thank you, Ms. Wells. Mr. Meek, do you have any questions for Dr. Turner or Mr. Sailors?
The only question I guess I really have, the parents that I have talked with, not very many, I'm trying to think if any, are ready for their kids to go back to school.
Mm-hmm.
They want to get rid of them, but they're scared to death to send them back to school. And so has there been any discussion?
Amen, Roger.
I guess I'm asking, has there been any discussion about extending this through the fall for the e-learning instead of going back to school?
Mr. Meek, we did. We'll let you guys know that our plan is not to start these until July. So we're talking about 4 weeks in July for these camps. We did ask Molly to consider, and I think this goes back to something Ms. Morrison Fair brought up earlier, for extended day services once school begins in the fall. Could this money be used for extended day services rather than all of it being used in the summer? One of the things that with this money is that it has to be spent by December 30th of this year. So it's not like the big pot of or the educational money that's come through that's in our 19 million we got out of what's allocated that can go to September of 21. These funds that we're asking for have to be spent by December 30 of 2020. So we're kind of limited in how we use that.
Well, I understand that, Scott, but I'm saying it's not going to be, or is it going to be mandatory that the kids makes this time up?
No, this is not mandatory. This is all optional for the children or the students who would come back and just try to receive some academic recovery of time lost this year.
I just doubt that in my opinion, that you'll have much participation, because I would much rather my grandkids not come back to school until this damn thing's gone away.
And I think that's one of the points I made earlier. We have had some, according to Jeff McCoy, we've had some parents who have expressed that same opinion when they've called and said your child is eligible to attend. They've declined because of what you're expressing right now.
Yeah, I just, I think even if we had to forego and stop school for a year and then continue it, I would much rather have a grandchild that's alive than be buried and dead and gone. So I think it's going to be very difficult for us, for you, to assure parents that these kids are going to be safe even this fall. I guess that's all I have to say.
Well, if I could
Thanks,
chime in there to Roger's point, Roger, that's a huge consideration with the entire committee, is the fact that at some point in time, we're going to have to, I'm going to call it a sales pitch, but that's not the right word. We're going to have to come up with a plan that builds that comfort. And we're looking at options that could be a hybrid of some students in the classroom and some students participating remotely from the same class or observing the same class being instructed. To high school issues, you know, Burke mentioned a little while ago about when in a high school setting, the class changes and you have to sanitize the class hypothetically every time it changes. Well, then the question begged itself in our group conversation was, leave the kids in the class, let the teachers move. So there's more questions connected to this conversation that are just unanswered right now because, as Scott said earlier, we've only had 2 meetings. The subcommittees have only had 1 meeting. Now we've got another call tomorrow, another WebEx meeting tomorrow. My subcommittee's got a meeting on Friday. So this has turned into an every day of the week thing so far. But we're working at it.
Guys, the only question I have, oh, sorry. Go, Roger, I'm sorry.
I was just saying, I understand, but, you know, I haven't talked with anyone that's ready to send their kids back to school. You know, they're scared themselves and they're more scared for their child. And I don't know how you're ever going to get that comfort level back in the near future.
That's understandable.
You know, Molly Spearman or anybody else can assure me that my grandkids are going to be safe and immune from somebody else having the virus, and especially as little that they still know about it, that they're going to be safe in school, in any school. I'll shut up, and I said what I needed to say.
Thank you, Mr. Meek. Guys, the only question I had, and I just wondered if it has come up in any of the discussions, either with the superintendents or in y'all's committee work, those college seniors who are education majors who should have done their student teaching this spring, are they eligible for employment in the fall?
They are.
Yes,
yeah.
They are. Okay, so there's a waiver that allows them to be employed by the district and miss that semester of student teaching.
That is correct.
Okay, great. I think that's Mr. Sailors.
Well, I'm sorry. I just got a clarification question for you. So would it be appropriate for us to ask for or direct the chair of the committee to take this conversation today and develop any applicable resolutions that this committee needs to take to the board? And quite frankly, I don't think we're in a position today or in a position both from time or knowledge to sit here and wordsmith a resolution. So would you as chairman take the responsibility of taking this information, wordsmithing something with Julie that you could bring back to the committee for input? And then once the committee has a comfort level on a resolution for whatever, then we could take it from the committee to the board. Is that a process that I'm asking, I guess, for consent? And if it is consent, if there's nobody objecting to it, I'll make the motion. We need to leave from this meeting with some action in my mind.
A second.
I'm not sure I followed all that.
So before there's a motion.
If I were to put this in a motion, it would be for the committee to direct the chairman of the committee to develop a resolution or resolutions associated with the topics that we've discussed today for the committee to approve and then pass forward to the board.
Can I,
What
can I
sort of-
Mr. Chair, can I interject for a minute?
Yeah, Ms. Grayson, then we'll go back to Ms. Wells.
So when you say direct the committee, are you talking about just for clarification, IDEA, broadband, the other rounds of federal funding directly to districts?
Yes.
Okay. Anything else, just so we're all clear about what we're talking about?
I would think I'm not sure if you're asking me or Chuck.
Well, I'll direct it to the chair.
So I would think that it sounds like there's one theme around federal flexibility, which has to do with IDEA and these testing waivers and kind of supporting more flexibility on those two federal issues. It seems like there was another conversation about recognizing community needs and the need for state support around broadband, this idea of prepaying school districts rather than letting them being reimbursed, just kind of a theme around recognizing the needs that our communities have in supporting families. And then it sounds like there's a totally separate topic around transportation and perhaps some support on the committee's work around flexibility, which I think probably we wouldn't have until the committee had more defined language.
I would agree with that, yes.
So it sounds like maybe two, one around federal flexibility and one around community supports. Did I miss any, Ms. Grayson?
Yeah, I think that covered my points.
Who's doing?
Miss
Hey,
Wells.
Scott, mute your phone, mute your camera, Scott.
Miss Wells. I don't think there's a motion on the floor, so I think we're just talking.
Yeah, well, I mean, that clarified it for me because we kind of went down some other rabbit holes. And so I was trying to I wanted to be sure I understood what it is we thought we were going to be writing positions on. A counter to being concerned about families having options because they don't want to come back to school is the fact that we need to get some kids back in the door so that we can help them with their, not only their education piece, but the social and emotional issues that they're dealing with because they're isolated. So I think there's as much damage being done to students because of social isolation, it seems to me, as there is from health issues with these kids. So as long as we're not going into that, we're not going into that realm and trying to make any sort of case, I think that would be do an expanded conversation before we started making any kind of recommendations on that.
And to Lisa's point, it's an expanded conversation once we get answers to a lot of these questions. But
Sure.
Derek, to your point, I think circling the wagons around federal issues related to funding and state issues related to funding is a good first start.
I do. Can I kind of follow, just kind of put something out there? And I don't know if it's something we can discuss today or if it needs to be discussed somewhere else. But when you think about, we're talking about how we get back to normal and when we get back to normal, how to make this transition. But, what about the piece that this has clearly disrupted our educational system enough that there are some things that we believe we could do and should deliver differently? So, in the context of, and maybe this is kind of just more a board discussion and just a reason to have a board meeting in the context of thinking about what those disruptions are. I mean, should we have e-learning opportunities and alternatives available to families from here on out? Right now we approve homeschool applications. People can homeschool, or they can do charter schools for online stuff, or they can come to us, or they can go to private schools. So I don't know if there's any, from an advocacy standpoint, I don't know if this was a good time to start thinking about any sort of leeway that we think we would need to deliver any sort of new model with regard to our education. But I'd like to have, maybe not this meeting, but maybe a future meeting, have the administration talk to us a little bit about, that piece, trying to pick our head up and look past next month and the next month, but kind of look broader. What should we be asking for now? Because there's a great motivation right now to be allowed to make some substantive changes in how we deliver services, I think. So that's it.
Okay. Mr. Sailors, do you have a motion?
I think it's already been made and seconded.
We have a second from Ms. Grayson.
Yeah.
The motion is to direct the chair to work with staff to develop resolutions based on the conversations we've had that we just discussed, and to bring those to the board for approval. What's not in the motion, but what I think I will be comfortable doing is getting with each board member individually with drafts of those resolutions to work on their comfort level in the language before we bring them to the board. So we are approving a concept here in the interest of time, but a final draft would be seen by every committee member before it goes to the board. Any further discussion on that motion before we vote? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 All right, I heard an aye from Mr. Sailors, Ms. Grayson, Mr. Meek, Ms. Wells,
Aye.
and Ms. Morrison Fair,
Aye.
and Mr. Shamley,
Yes, aye.
and Mr. Suddeth. I don't think I've heard from. Michelle, I'm glad to see you here. But I think she's silent. Okay, so the motion passes. Next item on the agenda is other business. Is there any other business before this committee? Ms. Wells, one thing I heard in your comments that I think I really feel like maybe we need to go ahead and think about is getting this group together more frequently. So I'll work with the chair to find an opportunity when this group could meet on a recurring basis so we can get more of these discussions in future meetings. Dr. Royster, do you have anything else you want us to look at for future meetings before we wrap up here?
No, I think, down the road somewhere you do want to look at, we've already had a little bit of discussion about how this might alter the future. I think there's a realization, particularly from the state superintendent, that there are a lot of things that she's gotten waivers to really eliminate regulation, that some of that will become permanent. And I think she understands the importance and the need to it. The other thing that, as you all could tell by just the discussions that you've had today and the discussions that are going on at the state level, some of the things we've shared with you, some of the down the road stuff we're probably going to have to do down the road, because it's literally taking everything we can do to adapt to run in an environment we're not accustomed to running in. Preparing for next year is even more challenging, because now we don't know if that environment is going to be like the one we're in now, or it's going to be some blend of the two, or it's going to be something we've not yet envisioned. So there is, as you've seen by all that, for every answer that's provided, it raises a dozen more questions. Or there are aspects of it that somebody has not thought about. And, going back to Mr. Meek's point, there will be some people that will not want their children back in school yet. There's some people that would throw them on the bus in the morning if we drove it through the neighborhood with the door open. And then there's in between. And what we are not yet prepared to do, but what we're working on is running a system that's blended, where some people are there and some people aren't there simultaneously. So that's taking a considerable amount of work. We spent a good bit of time. In fact, we spent about 3 hours this morning in what might a schedule look like in a high school, because that's the most complicated one. What it might look like in a high school, maintaining social distancing and having students come on a semi-regular basis, and also provide support to the ones that weren't there that day virtually, and how all that might look, and realizing it's got to a degree to line up with elementary and middle school schedules. It can't be totally independent or divorced from that. And then the fact that the point was made earlier, when they get up and move, you got to disinfect where they sit. Now, if only half of them are there, you can put some X's in some seats, so you only have to do it every other period. But at middle school, a solution is what Mr. Saylors said they brought up in one of those committee meetings. You can move the teacher. You can't do that in high school because the high school students don't move as a group. So middle school, much easier to address than high school. Elementary school, because pretty much they stay in the same place all day, other than art, music, PE, specials. A little bit easier there. But huge challenge in all this. And then, what will parents do with their children? Because they're going to have to be, to a degree, they're back at work. But they got their children home some amount of time each week, whether it's every other day or 2 days a week or 3 days a week. But probably the greatest challenge to all of this is the uncertainty of what the environment looks like. When will this end? When will it be safe to go back to not being 6 feet away from each other? There is so little certainty around any of it. So I very much appreciate you all having this discussion today and the tremendous support that all of you and the entire board has provided throughout this, because this is a new adventure for all of us.
Thank you, Dr. Royster. I really appreciate everything you guys are doing. And if there is no other business, then we will call this meeting adjourned, and we'll see you guys next Tuesday. Just so you can experience what's happening in my house right now, the dog and the cat are fighting in the background. It's super fun.